The last Christmas she ever cooked. Last Christmas, my father looked me dead in the eye, smirked, and called me a fool. He said it the way he said most things, without apology, without hesitation, with the specific contempt of a man who had spent 62 years being wrong about everything and had somehow never noticed. He was looking at the check in my hand, the one my grandmother had just slid across the table in a cream-colored envelope with my name written on the front in her sharp, slanted handwriting. $5 million. I know how that sounds. I know what you're thinking. I thought the same thing for approximately 4 seconds. And then I looked at the blue ink, at the name of the bank, at the signature at the bottom, and I understood that the piece of paper in my hand was exactly what it said it was. My father tore his in half before I finished reading mine. My mother zipped hers down the center with the decisive, practiced motion of a woman who had been making dramatic gestures her entire life and had gotten very good at them. The two halves landed in the gravy boat. My brother Danny crumpled his into a ball, flicked it onto the rug like a losing lottery ticket, and laughed. A jagged, ugly sound that filled the dining room of my grandmother's house in Crestfall, Vermont, and bounced off the walls she had painted herself 30 years ago. My sister Brianna was the worst. She picked up her check, angled her phone to catch the light just right, and held the $5 million figure toward her camera with the practiced ease of someone who had been performing her life for strangers, since before performing your life for strangers was something people did professionally. "Check out this prop, guys," she said, her voice hitting that high artificial register she used for her live streams. "Grandma's really gone full holiday chaos this year. Watch this." She tossed it into the fireplace. I watched the fire take the edges first, that specific, acrid smell of burning ink and expensive paper, and then consume the rest in 3 seconds while Brianna's followers sent red heart emojis cascading down her screen. My grandmother did not blink. She stood at the head of the table in her corn-yellow sweater, her silver hair pinned back tight, and watched the ash of $5 million spiral up the chimney with the expression of a general who has just confirmed what she already knew about the people she was fighting. I looked down at my check. I smoothed the crease with my thumb. I folded it once, twice, into a neat square, and tucked it into my left chest pocket, the same pocket where I kept the things that mattered. I stood up. "Thank you, Grandma," I said. My voice came out the way it did when I delivered a status report. Clear, level, meaning exactly what it said and nothing more. She gave one sharp nod, her eyes sharp and dark, and carrying the specific intelligence of someone who has been underestimated for so long they have learned to use it as a weapon. Met mine for exactly 2 seconds. "Only once, Avery," she whispered. I walked out into the Vermont winter without my coat. The cold hit me like a wall. The specific, biting mountain cold of Crestfall in December, the kind that finds every gap in your clothing and settles in your bones. I pressed my palm flat against my chest and felt the sharp corner of the paper through the fabric. My grandmother lived on a fixed pension in a house with a leaking roof and a furnace that ran on borrowed time. Where had she gotten $25 million? I stood in the driveway of her house, the gravel I had shoveled every winter for 10 years, the porch light I had rewired 2 Christmases ago, the garden beds I had helped her put to sleep every October, and I understood that tomorrow morning, when Granite State Bank opened its doors, everything I thought I knew about June Cole was going to change. I got in my truck and drove. The house in Crestfall had not been locked in 47 years. That detail matters. In a small Vermont mountain town where everyone knows everyone and the nearest city is an hour and a half down a 2-lane road that ices over from November to March, an unlocked door is a statement. It means, you are welcome here, you are family. This place belongs to all of us. Grandma June had kept that door unlocked through blizzards and power outages and 3 decades of a family that had grown progressively less worthy of the gesture. The night of Christmas Eve, the air inside smelled of baked banana bread, oak wood smoke, and something else. A specific quality of silence that I had learned in 10 years of military service to recognize as the silence before something irreversible. They did not arrive. They invaded. My father, Frank, led the charge. He didn't knock. He never knocked anywhere, as though the act of announcing yourself implied an uncertainty about your welcome that he refused to entertain. He kicked the slush off his boots directly onto Grandma June's hardwood floor, leaving a trail of gray filth across wood she had polished that morning. He grunted something about the drive and headed for the head of the table, my grandfather's chair, empty for 11 years, and sat in it with the ease of a man claiming something he had never earned. Danny followed. He smelled of cigarettes and the specific desperation of a man whose business was failing and who had not yet admitted this to himself. He tossed his keys onto the lace tablecloth without looking at Grandma June, pointed a finger at my face and said, "Check the brake line on my truck before you leave, Avery. It's been pulling left." To my brother, a logistics officer who had spent a decade moving equipment across combat zones, was just a free mechanic with a government salary. Brianna came in with her phone already recording, panning the camera around the room with the narrating voice she used for content. "Oh my God, guys, look at this wallpaper. She's had this since like 1987. It's giving very much museum of someone's grandma vibes." She paused to frame a shot of the nativity scene on the mantel. "Cute though. Vintage." My mother Carol brought up the rear, adjusting her coat with the expression of a woman who had agreed to come to this dinner under protest and wanted everyone to know it. Dinner was what dinner at Frank and Carol's table always was. A performance of family that had nothing to do with the actual people present. Frank complained the food was slow. Carol made a remark about the vintage of the tablecloth. Danny spent 20 minutes asking me to transfer him $200 for a speeding ticket. Brianna ate with one hand and scrolled with the other. Grandma June served. She moved between the kitchen and the dining room with the quiet, deliberate grace of someone who has made peace with the people around her and is no longer expending energy on hoping they will change. I watched her from my corner of the table. I had been watching her differently since October. Since the afternoon she had sat me down at this same table, her hand wrapped around a coffee mug going cold, and told me about the pancreatic diagnosis in the same tone she used to read weather reports. Stage 4, known since July. No treatment. "No tubes, Avery," she had said, her grip on my wrist surprisingly fierce for a woman who looked like she was made of paper. "I'm not spending my last months being poked in a room full of plastic furniture while your father stands in the hallway arguing about the house." She had looked at me with those sharp dark eyes and said, "I'm going to give some gifts this year. It's going to be interesting." I had understood, sitting across from her in that October kitchen with the oak leaves turning the color of dried blood outside the window, that my grandmother was not just dying. She was planning. She was a woman who had spent 47 years watching her children become people she didn't recognize, and she had decided to spend her last Christmas finding out exactly what they were made of. When the plates were cleared, she walked to the oak sideboard. She pulled out a small box. She produced 5 cream-colored envelopes. The room went quiet, not out of respect, but out of the specific electric attention of people who have scented something valuable and are calculating how to reach it. I watched my father tear his open like a child at a birthday party. I watched his face go pale. I watched the sequence, the disbelief, the contempt, the performance of a man who had decided that the simplest explanation for something he didn't understand was that it was a lie. "Is this some kind of sick joke, Ma?" It wasn't, but he had already decided it was. And once Frank Gray had decided something, the deciding was the entire conversation. I held my own envelope. I felt the weight of the check inside it. I thought about the brass key Grandma June had pressed into my palm 3 weeks ago in a moment I hadn't fully understood until right now. When Attorney Reed calls," she had said, her voice dropping low, "you give this to him, only him." I opened the envelope. I read the numbers. I smoothed the check with my thumb and folded it into my chest pocket and stood up and said thank you, and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with the money. Then I walked out into the Vermont dark. Tomorrow morning, Granite State Bank would open at 9, and the war that my grandmother had been quietly, methodically, patiently preparing for the last 6 months of her life was about to begin. My family had just burned their ammunition. They didn't know it yet. 487 Saturdays. 200 miles. That was the distance between Fort Devens and the gravel driveway of Grandma June's house in Crestfall. I know the number precisely because I drove it every week for 10 years. 400 miles round trip every Saturday, without exception, in a battered F-150 with a heater that worked intermittently and a passenger seat that had developed a permanent lean from a decade of grocery bags and supply runs. My peers spent their Saturdays differently. I knew this because they told me, regularly, and with the specific enthusiasm of people who found my alternative incomprehensible. The bars near base, weekend trips to Boston, the particular necessary decompression of people who spent their weeks doing difficult things and needed their days off to be uncomplicated. I drove to Crestfall, not because I expected anything in return, not because I had calculated the investment and projected the return. I drove because in a family of people who had learned to treat every relationship as a transaction, my grandmother was the one person who had never once handed me a bill. The routine was precise. I pulled into the gravel drive around 10 in the morning, the engine ticking as it cooled in the Vermont air. She was always there, in the wicker chair on the porch if the weather allowed, in the kitchen with the door propped open if it didn't. She wore the same rotation of sweaters. She always had coffee ready. She always looked me over when I got out of the truck, a slow, careful inventory that started at my boots and ended at my face, checking for the specific kind of damage that doesn't show up on a medical report. "You still got your soul, Avery?" she'd ask. "Still got it, Grandma," I'd say, and we'd go inside. She never asked about the money. She never asked what I was saving, what I was planning, whether I had thought about my future in the specific transactional way that my mother raised the subject whenever we spoke, always framed as concern, always landing as inventory. Grandma June asked about my platoon. She asked about the logistics of moving equipment across a desert. She asked what the food was like and whether the people I served with were the kind of people worth knowing. She listened the way people listen when they are genuinely interested, which is rarer than it should be. When I left on Sunday evening, she had a habit. She pressed 2 folded $10 bills into my palm. "For gas," she'd say, her voice carrying the specific firmness of someone making a point that has nothing to do with the stated reason. I didn't need it. My captain's pay was sufficient. But I understood the rules of pride, the particular, essential dignity of a person who does not want to receive without giving, and I took the bills every time. Once I was back on the highway, I tucked them into an old Nike shoebox under the passenger seat. By the time Grandma June called me to that October kitchen table, the shoebox held 11 years of folded 10s and 20s. I had never counted it. I didn't need to. The drive back from Crestfall was where the family reached me. The truck would barely be on the main highway before my phone started. My mother's name first. Usually, Carol had a radar for the moment I left Grandma June's property, as though my departure triggered something in her. "Again?" was how she opened most of these calls. No greeting. Just the word, loaded with everything she meant by it. "She's your mother, Mom," I'd say. "She's a drain, Avery. You know your brother is struggling. Did she say anything about the accounts? Did she mention the house?" Danny's voice would appear in the background of these calls, muffled but audible, a specific, practiced murmur designed to be heard without being accountable for being heard. "Tell the army girl I need 2 bills, speeding ticket. Tell her to cough it up." Brianna's contributions arrived by text, usually within the hour. "AV, can I use your card for a venue deposit? Collab opportunity. I'll pay you back literally next month." She had been paying me back literally next month for 4 years. They saw the rank. They saw the hazard pay I had earned in places they couldn't have found on a map. They heard a cash register. They did not see the woman who had driven 400 miles round trip every weekend for a decade. They did not see the daughter who had been buying Grandma June's heart medication out of pocket since the insurance stopped covering it 18 months ago because the paperwork had been filed incorrectly and no one in the family could be bothered to fix it. I fixed it. I fixed most things in that house, quietly and without announcement. The kitchen sink in February, the porch railing in April, the furnace filter that hadn't been changed in 3 years and was running the system into the ground. I didn't mention these things because mentioning them would have required explaining why I was the one doing them, and that explanation led somewhere I didn't have the energy to go. October arrived with the specific, violent beauty of a Vermont autumn. The oak leaves turning the color of dried blood, the air carrying the first real edge of winter underneath the last warmth of the year. Grandma June sat me down at the kitchen table on an afternoon when the sun was going down early, and the shadows were long across the worn linoleum floor. She didn't preamble. "The doctors called it pancreatic," she said, her voice as steady as a weather report. "Stage 4. I've known since July." The air left the room. I felt my hand tighten around my coffee mug, the ceramic edge biting into my palm, and I held on. Military discipline. You don't fall apart on the battlefield. You assess the situation. You stabilize. "Chemo," I said, the word coming out fast and tactical. "Specialist in Boston. I'll cover everything. She shook her head, a slow, final movement. No tubes, Avery. No plastic sheets and nurses who don't know my name. I'm not spending my last months while your father stands in the hallway arguing about the house. Her hand, cold, thin, the skin so translucent I could see the blue map of her veins, reached out and closed around my wrist. Keep this between us. I want one more Christmas that looks like a family. And then I want to see who they really are. I looked into those sharp, dark eyes. She wasn't frightened. She was lucid and deliberate and completely in control of what she was doing, a general executing a final maneuver with the precision she had been developing her entire life. I'm going to give some gifts this year, she said, the specific, lethal calm of her voice making the ordinary words sound like an order. It's going to be interesting. I held her hand and said nothing. I understood then why she had asked me to keep the secret. It wasn't weakness. It was strategy. She needed the Christmas to look normal, so the test would be real. She needed Frank and Carol and Danny and Brianna to walk through that door without warning and show her exactly what they were, one last time, on the record, with a witness. She had chosen me as that witness. It was the heaviest thing she had ever given me. I drove back to base that October Sunday in total silence. No radio. Just the hum of tires on the highway and the weight of what I was carrying pressing against my ribs. I kept thinking about the shoebox of gas money under the seat. I kept thinking about the check she had described. $5 million each. 5 envelopes, one final evaluation of the people who shared her blood. And I kept thinking about something else. My grandmother had described her finances to me always in the language of careful limitation. Fixed pension, modest savings. The leaking roof she kept patching rather than replacing because replacing it would cost more than she could manage. The furnace she nursed through each winter like a patient in recovery. A woman living that life did not have $25 million to distribute, which meant there was something I didn't know about June Cole. Something substantial. Something she had been keeping as carefully as she kept everything else that mattered. Close, quiet, and away from the people who would have consumed it without understanding what it was. Ma'am. January came to Crestfall the way it always did, without ceremony, without sympathy, with 3 feet of snow and the specific structural cold that tests everything it touches. Grandma June's hip gave out on a Wednesday at 3 in the morning. I got the call at 3:14. I was packed and on the road by 3:45. She was alive. She was conscious. She was, characteristically, more concerned about the mess the fall had made than about the fall itself. I did not call a nursing home. I had seen what nursing homes looked like for people without the resources for the expensive ones, the institutional smell, the undertreated pain, the specific loneliness of people waiting in rooms where no one knew their name. I was not putting June Cole in one of those rooms. I filed for emergency family leave from Fort Devens, packed my rucksack, and moved into her living room. The transition was tactical. I pushed the furniture to create space for a rented hospital bed. I cleared the surfaces for medical supplies, morphine vials, antiseptic, blood pressure cuff, the logbook I kept for medication schedules, and vital sign tracking. I ran the house the way I ran a forward operating base, with spreadsheets and turning schedules and the specific, disciplined attention of someone who understands that the details are where you win or lose. The smell of banana bread disappeared. It was replaced by isopropyl alcohol and the particular metallic undertone of serious illness, a smell I knew from field hospitals and did not flinch from because flinching served no one. I spent 45 days in that house. I learned the precise geography of her pain, which positions caused it, which medications blunted it, which hours of the night were hardest. I learned to sleep in 10-minute intervals in a kitchen chair, my hand always within reach of her pulse. I learned the rhythm of her breathing well enough to hear when it changed before the monitor registered it. The Gray family went absent without leave. My father Frank appeared once. A Tuesday afternoon, 20 minutes of standing in the doorway, shifting his weight from boot to boot, looking at everything except the woman dying in the bed. He muttered something about being busy at the plant. He did not sit down. He did not offer to bring groceries. He drove away and did not come back. My mother Carol called 3 times a week. She never asked about Grandma June's pain levels. She asked whether Grandma June had said anything further about the checks. She asked whether I had looked for a checkbook. She asked, with the specific, careful phrasing of someone who had consulted an attorney, whether the cancellation of the Christmas checks might be legally contested if Grandma June's mental competency could be questioned. "She's dying, Mom," I said every time. "We're all struggling, Avery," Carol said every time. I hung up on her every time. Danny and Brianna did not call. They did not visit. There was no profit in a room that smelled of antiseptic and impending loss. No content to be made from the slow, unglamorous work of keeping a dying woman comfortable and clean and not alone. They had come for the payout. When the vault proved locked, they deserted. Late January, a blizzard that buried Crestfall in 2 feet of white silence. The power flickered and steadied. The candles I kept on the counter for exactly this contingency were already lit, their light warm and unsteady across the walls of a room that smelled of medicine and the specific, accumulated presence of a long life. Grandma June beckoned me close. Her hand was cold. The skin was so thin it was nearly translucent, the blue veins visible beneath it like rivers seen from altitude. She reached under her pillow and produced a small brass key, old, the metal worn smooth by decades of handling. "When Attorney Reed calls," she said, her voice reduced to something thin and careful, each word costing more than it used to, "you give this to him, only him." I took the key. It was cold in my palm. I didn't ask what it opened. I didn't ask about the $40 million I had begun to suspect existed behind the leaking roof, and the fixed pension, and the $10 bills for gas. I just tucked it into my chest pocket. "Mission accepted, Grandma," I said. She gave a single nod, her eyes closed. February 3rd arrived with a pale, weak sun. At 5:47 in the morning, the heart monitor produced the long, flat tone that means the watching is over. I sat with her hand in mine until the last warmth left it. Then I stood up. I pulled the sheet to her chin with the care I had been giving every small thing for 45 days. I stood at the foot of the bed. I came to attention. I saluted. The commander was gone. I reached for my phone. My hands were steady. My chest felt like it was full of broken glass, but my hands were steady. I called Carol. She picked up on the 3rd ring. I could hear a hairdryer and the upbeat noise of a salon in the background. "She's gone, Mom," I said. A pause. Not a pause of grief. A pause of calculation. The specific brief silence of someone shifting from one mode to another. "Oh, well," Carol said. "When's the funeral?" "I hope it's not the 10th. I have Marcus at 2, and you know how hard it is to reschedule. And Avery, don't forget to look through the house before anything gets locked up. There might be..." I pressed the red button. I looked at the brass key on the nightstand. The vultures thought they were coming for a funeral. They were walking into a court-martial. And I was the one who had been preparing the case for 45 days. The kill zone. December 26th arrived in Crestfall the way the day after Christmas always does in a Vermont mountain town, gray, hollowed out, the streets empty of everything except slush and the particular deflation of a holiday that has ended. I sat in the lobby of Granite State Bank at 8:53 in the morning. My back was not touching the chair. My boots were clean. My hands were folded in my lap with the specific stillness of someone who has learned that stillness is a form of readiness. That the person who is not moving is often the person who is most prepared to move. Thomas Webb, the branch manager, did not walk toward me. He hurried. He was a man built for the predictable rhythms of interest rates and mortgage renewals, and today he looked like someone had handed him a live grenade and asked him to hold it until further notice. His tie was crooked. His face was the color of old chalk. He gave me a nod that was more of a twitch and led me back through the bank's interior, past the tellers, past the glass offices, and into the close, overheated space of his private office. He closed the door. The deadbolt sliding into place made a sound like a small, dry snap. The sound of a secret being locked in a room with the only 2 people who knew it. He did not sit. He pressed his back against the desk and looked at me. And then he looked at the cream-colored envelope I had placed on the blotter between us. And then he looked at me again. "Where did you get this?" he said. His voice had lost all professional polish. What was left was the raw, stripped sound of a man who had spent the night reviewing accounts he had not expected to review. "A Christmas gift," I said, "from my grandmother." Thomas Webb took a breath that seemed to cost him something. He reached into his drawer. He produced a thick blue folder. He set his glasses on his nose with hands that were not entirely steady. He leaned over the check. He read it once, twice. He looked up at me. And he said 4 words that rearranged the gravity of everything I had understood about my grandmother, my family, and the 47 years June Cole had spent in a house with a leaking roof on a fixed pension while her children called her a drain. "The check is real." "Dan." I needed 3 seconds. In a decade of military service, I had received information that required immediate recalibration. Convoy routes changed by intelligence updates, personnel decisions reversed without warning, the specific, violent surprise of situations that did not unfold according to plan. I knew how to absorb a data point that contradicted the existing model and update the model without losing operational effectiveness. I took 3 seconds. Then I said, "Tell me everything." Thomas Webb opened the blue folder. "Your grandmother came in here in early November," he said, his voice finding a steadier register now that the initial shock had been shared. "She sat exactly where you're sitting. She didn't smile once. She had me set up 5 separate withdrawal orders, $25 million in total, moved from an offshore holding account into liquid instruments." I kept my face neutral. I kept my breathing even. "How does a woman on a fixed pension move $25 million, I said, "without the IRS arriving at her door?" Thomas Webb turned his monitor toward me. The number on the screen hit me the way a physical impact hits. A single, sudden force that the body absorbs before the mind catches up. $40,200,000. Real estate holdings across 3 states. Diversified investment portfolios structured behind shell companies with names that meant nothing and contained everything. A financial architecture so quietly, carefully constructed that it had existed for decades without attracting the attention of anyone who might have tried to access it. My grandmother, the woman who pressed folded $10 bills into my palm for gas money, who patched her leaking roof rather than replacing it, who served Christmas ham and baked banana bread in a house that smelled of cedar and old wood and the specific warmth of a life lived without pretense, had been sitting on a mountain of gold for 40 years. And she had let her children believe she had nothing, because she had understood, with the cold precision of a strategist, that the people who would come for her money were already revealing themselves every time they didn't come for her. "She told me exactly what would happen," Thomas Webb said, pressing a crumpled handkerchief against his forehead. "She said they would think the checks were a joke. She said they would treat $5 million like trash." He paused. "She was not surprised, Ms. Cole. She was prepared." I stood up. I took the check from the blotter and returned it to my chest pocket. "Keep this between us, Thomas," I said. "That is an order." I walked out of the bank into the December air. My phone detonated before I reached the truck. The bank's automated fraud system had done its job with mechanical, indifferent efficiency, flagging the accounts, issuing verification calls to every recipient of the 5 checks, notifying them of the status of the instruments they had destroyed. My family was finding out, not from me, from a computer program that did not know them and did not care about them and was simply executing its function, which was to tell the truth about money regardless of who it inconvenienced. I climbed into the F-150 and watched my phone screen light up with my father's name. I did not answer. I put the truck in gear and drove toward the hill. Shum. It took 112 minutes for the first vehicle to appear. I was in Grandma June's kitchen, the smell of pine and cold floorboards settling around me, when the squeal of tires cut through the wind outside. Frank Gray did not wait for his engine to stop running. He vaulted out of his truck cab with the specific, lurching urgency of a man whose body was moving faster than his thinking, his coat unzipped despite the cold, his face a mottled, furious purple, the veins in his neck thick and pulsing. He charged up the porch steps with his fists already forming. Sylvia, he had never called her June, had always insisted on the formal name as though informality was a concession he refused to make. "Open this door right now. You reissue those checks. You think you can play us for fools?" Danny's truck arrived seconds later. He jumped out and began circling the house, cupping his hands against the windows, his breath fogging the glass. A man looking for a point of entry, any vulnerability in a perimeter he had already failed to breach through the front. I moved toward the door. A hand closed around my wrist. Thin, cold, surprisingly fierce. Grandma June was standing beside me in her corn-yellow sweater, and she looked not frightened, not fragile, not the woman her children had spent decades treating as a resource to be managed. She looked finished, resolved. The specific, settled calm of a commanding officer who has executed a plan and is watching the results confirm what she already knew. She walked to the glass panel of the front door. Frank was there, his face pressed so close to the glass that his breath was fogging it, his fist still raised, his eyes wild and bloodshot with the specific desperation of a man who has just watched his certainties evaporate. "Richard," she said. Her voice was not loud, it didn't need to be. He stopped, the fist lowered. "I gave each of you $5 million, she said, her voice carrying the flat, deliberate weight of a verdict being read. "I gave you a life you didn't earn, on top of the one you already didn't appreciate. 4 of you decided the paper was garbage. You tore it, you burned it, you laughed while you did it." She paused. "The test is finished, Richard. The result is recorded." "Ma, listen to me. Go home," she said. Frank's face cycled through something ugly. The specific, infantile rage of a man who has never in his life been told no by a woman he couldn't bully into silence. His foot pulled back. His hand reached for the door handle. Grandma June reached up. Clack! The brass deadbolt slid home. The sound was small. In the silence of that kitchen, it was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I stood very still. For 47 years, that door had been unlocked. It had been unlocked through blizzards and power outages and 3 decades of children who had become progressively less worthy of the welcome it extended. It was the symbol of June Cole's particular, stubborn generosity, the belief held long past the point where evidence supported it that family was worth the open door. The bolt was home now. The gray bloodline was on the outside of it, and they were strangers. Frank kicked the porch planter on his way down the steps. Danny put his fist through a section of porch railing I had repaired the previous spring. Their voices carried through the glass for another 20 minutes, cycling through threats and pleas and the specific, ugly vocabulary of people who have confused entitlement with love for so long they can no longer tell the difference. Grandma June did not look at the door. She looked at me. "Check the perimeter, Avery," she said. "Yes, ma'am," I said. The will was read in the offices of Attorney Marcus Reed on a Thursday in late February. The room smelled of leather and old coffee and the specific anticipatory tension of people who believe they are about to receive something they deserve. Frank sat at the head of the conference table, his knee bouncing a rapid, frantic rhythm against the wood. Danny was leaning back with his arms crossed, projecting the studied nonchalance of a man who has already spent the money in his head. Brianna had her phone angled at the table, her thumb moving. Carol sat beside Frank in the posture of a woman who had coordinated her outfit for this occasion and found the room inadequately appreciative. I sat at the far end of the table. Marcus Reed entered without ceremony. He set a worn leather briefcase on the table, opened it, and produced a document that had the specific, dense weight of something that had been prepared with considerable care. He read the minor provisions first. $5,000 to the Crestfall Public Library, $10,000 to the County Food Bank, $12,000 to the elementary school's lunch program. Frank's knee bounced faster. Then Marcus Reed cleared his throat. "Regarding the residual estate," he said, his voice as flat and deliberate as a gavel, "inclusive of the primary residence, all land holdings, and the full value of associated investment portfolios, totaling $40,200,000. The room went airless. "The decedent has bequeathed the entirety of this estate to her granddaughter, Avery Cole." The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Frank stood up so fast his chair hit the wall. "This is a fraud," he said, his voice cracking. "She was on morphine. Avery manipulated her. She spent 45 days whispering in that woman's ear while she was barely conscious." "Sit down, Mr. Gray," Marcus Reed said, with the specific, practiced authority of a man who has watched this scene play out before and finds it neither surprising nor interesting. "This document was signed, witnessed, and notarized 6 months prior to the decedent's death, at a time when 3 independent medical evaluations confirmed full cognitive capacity." He adjusted his glasses and read from a handwritten note attached to the back of the will. "There is a final codicil. I quote, 'I leave everything to Avery. She was the only one who came home on Saturdays. She was the only one who cleaned my floors and looked me in the eye when the world went dark. And most importantly, she is the only one who never once asked me what I had.'" "Bien?" I kept my hands flat on my thighs. I kept my spine straight. I looked at my father's face and watched the realization arrive. Not the realization about the money, but the deeper one. The one that had been available to him for 30 years if he had been willing to look at it. That the person he had dismissed as the reliable one, the useful one, the one who could be counted on to show up and ask for nothing, had been seen by the woman he had ignored in ways he had never been seen at all. Frank leaned across the table. His voice dropped to a hiss. "You think this is over?" he said. You think we're just going to let you walk out of here with what belongs to this family? Get yourself a real lawyer, Avery. We're coming for every cent. I reached into my pocket. I felt the cold weight of the brass key. The war started a long time ago, Dad, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You just didn't know you'd already lost. The lawsuit papers arrived 4 days later. A man in a polyester suit shoved a manila envelope into my hands on the porch of Grandma June's house and trudged back to his car without making eye contact. I sat at the oak table and read the complaint. Undue influence, coercion, psychological manipulation of a vulnerable adult. Frank and Danny's signatures at the bottom. They were calling my decade of Saturdays a crime. They were calling my 45 days of caregiving a manipulation. They were taking the only things I had ever given freely and trying to use them as weapons against me. I felt a dry, hollow sound move through my chest. Not a laugh exactly, more the sound of a certainty clicking into place. I picked up my phone and called Marcus Reed. They filed, I said. I know, he said. Come in tomorrow. Bring the key. How? The vault at Granite State Bank smelled of cold metal and old air and the specific preserved silence of a space where important things are kept away from people who would misuse them. Thomas Webb let us down without speaking. Box 402. The brass key slid into the lock with the ease of something designed to fit exactly and nothing else. Click. The drawer opened. No gold. No currency. Just a stack of documents bound with a simple piece of twine, and beneath them, a blue leather journal with a coffee-stained cover and frayed edges. Marcus Reed lifted the first folder. 3 psychiatric evaluations. Dr. Sarah Aris from Portland. Dr. James Miller from Boston. A state-certified specialist from Burlington. Each one stamped in red ink with the same conclusion. Sylvia June Cole is of sound mind. Patient possesses full cognitive capacity. No evidence of external coercion. The dates were precise and deliberate. 1 evaluation 3 weeks before the will was signed, 1 10 days after, 1 the week before Christmas. She had been tested for lucidity while Frank was at the plant, and Danny was losing money at a casino, and Carol was at a salon and Brianna was filming content. She had built her own legal fortress, stone by stone, with the specific patience of someone who had anticipated every attack. Beneath the evaluations were my bank statements. Every withdrawal from my military savings that had paid for her medication, her medical supplies, her dignity in the months when dignity required someone else's money and attention. Every receipt, every transfer, a complete financial record of what I had given and what the rest of them had not. And then the journal. I recognized her handwriting immediately. Sharp, slanted, unapologetic. I opened it to the middle. February 5th, 2015. Avery came today. She fixed the leak under the kitchen sink. She didn't ask for anything. Richard called twice, wanted money for a truck repair, didn't ask about my hip. I turned pages. August 12th, 2018. Avery brought supplies from the base. We talked about the desert. She looks tired. Her eyes are still clear. She's the only one who doesn't look at me like I'm a balance sheet. March 3rd, 2020. Danny called, wanted to borrow the truck, didn't ask how I was. Carol texted about the house, whether I'd thought about getting my affairs in order. Avery came Saturday, and we planted the window box. 487 entries. 487 Saturdays, recorded with the meticulous precision of a woman who understood that the truth, documented carefully and kept safely, is the most durable weapon available. Every visit I had made, every visit they had not. Every time Frank had forgotten her birthday. Every time Danny had borrowed from her purse. Every time Carol had called to assess rather than to ask. Every time Brianna had filmed the house without asking permission and posted it for strangers without saying thank you. This was not a diary. It was a pre-recorded testimony from a woman who had known exactly what was coming and had spent years making sure the record would be unimpeachable. I closed the journal. Marcus Reed looked at me across the vault. This isn't a lawsuit, I said. No, he agreed. It's a court-martial. The preliminary hearing lasted one morning. I sat on the witness stand in my dress blues, back straight, hands folded, the specific composure of someone who has nothing to hide because nothing has been hidden. Frank and Danny's attorney, a man named Sterling, with a suit that caught the light like an oil slick, paced the floor with a gold pen and the practiced confidence of someone who had not yet read all the documents. Captain Cole, he began, his voice carrying the smooth drawl of a man who believed presentation was argument. You were stationed overseas for most of the past decade, thousands of miles away. Yet we're asked to believe that a vulnerable, dying woman chose to leave $40 million to the relative who was least present. Why you, Captain? Why not the family members who were here? Frank leaned forward in the gallery. He was waiting for me to argue, to defend, to perform the specific, exhausting theater of someone justifying their own worthiness. I looked at Sterling and kept my voice level. I showed up because it was Saturday, I said. That is the only reason. Sterling scoffed. Saturday? You're telling this court that $40 million is the price of a weekly visit? Marcus Reed stood up. He did not speak immediately. He walked to the judge's bench and laid down 3 documents: the psychiatric evaluations, the bank records, and the blue leather journal. Your Honor, he said, his voice carrying the low, unhurried authority of someone who knows they have already won. Captain Cole did not make weekly visits. She made 487 of them over 10 years without exception, while the plaintiffs averaged less than 1 visit per year. During the final 45 days of the decedent's life, Captain Cole provided full-time medical care at her own expense, while the plaintiffs made no contact. This journal, he set his hand on the blue cover, is the decedent's own contemporaneous record of every one of those visits and every one of their absences. The judge, a silver-haired woman with eyes like winter flint, pulled the journal toward her. The room went silent. The only sound was the dry rustle of pages turning, the specific sound of my grandmother's handwriting being read by a stranger who was seeing, for the first time, what 487 Saturdays actually looked like when someone had taken the time to write them down. The judge looked up. She looked at Frank. It was not a look of sympathy or neutrality or judicial detachment. It was a look of pure, unambiguous disgust. Case dismissed, she said. The gavel cracked against the block. With prejudice, the plaintiffs will be responsible for all legal fees incurred by the defense, effective immediately. This court is adjourned. The hallway outside the courtroom. Frank caught up with me before I reached the stairs. You think you won something? He said, his voice low and fractured. You manipulated a dying woman. You stole what belonged to this family. You're the most cold-blooded person I've ever known. I stopped. I turned. I looked at the man who had tracked slush across his mother's polished floors and sat in his dead father's chair without asking and called a $5 million check a sick joke and never once in 10 years of Saturdays wondered where I was going on Saturday mornings. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. You wanted the prize, Dad, I said. You just didn't want the patrol. I turned and walked toward the exit. A camera flash went off to my left. A local reporter from the Crestfall Gazette, standing near the water fountain. The next morning, the headline across the front page read, "The Saturday Daughter." The dominoes did not merely fall after that, they crumbled. Frank's employer, a regional manufacturing firm whose management team had read the paper over their morning coffee, did not want a man who had sued his dying mother for undue influence representing the company. He received a pink slip before lunch. Brianna's discovery phase produced her hidden credit card statements. $80,000 in lifestyle debt she had kept from her husband. He filed for divorce before the week was out. Danny's construction business, already leveraged to the edge, could not absorb the court-ordered legal fees. His line of credit was pulled. A padlock appeared on his shop door. A foreclosure notice went up in his front yard. They had tried to use the law as a weapon. Instead, they had built their own gallows. I had not fired a single shot. The battlefield was covered in their casualties anyway. What June left. Carol arrived on a Tuesday in late March, not in the luxury SUV she had driven for the past 6 years. That was gone. Traded down when the lawsuit legal fees had begun cutting through the household accounts with the specific, indifferent efficiency of a financial instrument doing exactly what it was designed to do. She arrived in a rental sedan with a bumper held on by optimism and a coat that was good, but not as good as the one she'd been wearing at Christmas. She looked like a woman who had aged 8 years in 8 weeks. I was on the porch when she pulled in. Had been there since morning, drinking coffee and watching the last of the March snow melt off the porch railing I had repaired 3 springs ago. The mountain air had the specific, tentative quality of a Vermont season changing. Cold still, but with something underneath it that was beginning to relent. Carol climbed out of the car slowly. She walked toward the porch steps with the careful movements of someone who had rehearsed this approach and was now discovering that the rehearsal had not fully prepared her for the actual terrain. She looked at the house, at the windows, at the garden beds, at the door with its heavy brass deadbolt, with the eyes of a woman taking inventory. She looked at me, and then she did something I had not seen her do in a very long time. She stopped performing. Her face, stripped of the practiced expressions she had been deploying in place of genuine emotion for as long as I could remember, showed something raw and unguarded and genuinely frightened. She looked, for a moment, like the woman she might have been before she had decided that management was easier than love. "Avery," she said. Her voice broke on the second syllable. She came up the steps and put her arms around me. She smelled of knockoff perfume and the specific stale sadness of someone who had been sitting with difficult realizations for several weeks and had not been sleeping well. Her grip was thin. Her shoulders shook. I kept my hands at my sides. I looked over her shoulder at the tree line, the bare maple branches beginning to show the first faint suggestion of buds, the mountain beyond them still white at the peak. I counted. 1, 2, 3. "I'm so sorry, honey," she said into my shoulder. "I was confused. Your father pushed us. We were all so stressed, and he made us believe I should have been there. I should have been the one sitting with her at the end. I know that. I know what I did." 2 minutes and 41 seconds. That was how long the tears lasted. Carol pulled back. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue that was already well used. She looked at the house again, at the windows, at the door, and the inventory was back in her eyes, the calculation running underneath the grief like a current beneath still water. "The spa is in trouble," she said. Her voice had steadied. The performance of contrition was complete. We had moved to the next phase. "The town has been so cruel since the paper ran that story. The bank is calling the loans. I'm going to lose everything I built, Avery. I just need a bridge. 100,000, just to get through the summer. It's nothing to you now. You have 40 million sitting in a trust, and your mother is about to lose her business. You can't let that happen." I looked at her. I did not see a mother in the technical, emotional sense of the word, the person who shows up, who stays, who sits in the kitchen chair at 3 in the morning when the monitor changes tone. I had been that person. I knew what it felt like from the inside. What I saw was a woman who had driven 4 hours to ask for money and had calculated correctly that a performance of grief was the most efficient opening move. "No," I said. The word was small and flat and complete. Carol froze. The grief evaporated, instantly, cleanly, the way stage fog clears when the ventilation comes on. And what replaced it was the expression I had been seeing my entire life. The jagged, injured fury of a woman who had been told something she had decided she was not going to accept. "Excuse me?" "You heard me, Carol," I said. "I'm not giving you anything. Not the spa, not the loans, not a cup of coffee." "I am your mother," she said, her voice climbing. "I gave you 30 years. I raised you. You're sitting on a fortune that should belong to this family, and you're going to let me drown. Oh." I reached into the hallway and picked up a document from the table by the door. "Attorney Reed filed the paperwork yesterday," I said, holding it out to her. "The Sylvia June Cole Scholarship Foundation, $20 million into a trust. It will pay for school lunches, textbooks, and college applications in this county for the next 50 years. Carol stared at the document. The color left her face in a single total recession. 20, she said. 20 million? You're giving it to strangers. I'm giving it to this people Grandma June actually loved, I said. Which turns out to be a category that includes a lot of people in this town, and not very many people in this family. You selfish! Go home, Carol, I said. I stepped back into the house. I pulled the door shut. The sound of the latch was clean and final, the last report of a very long engagement. I stood in the hallway and listened to my mother's voice on the other side of the wood, cycling through its registers, fury to pleading to fury again, until it faded into the sound of a car engine starting, and tires on gravel, and then silence. I stood in the silence for a long moment. I felt nothing that needed to be managed. No guilt requiring suppression, no grief requiring discipline, just the clean, uncluttered quiet of a space where something that had been taking up room for a very long time had finally been removed. I went into the kitchen and made coffee. May and Crestfall smelled of mud and new grass, and the specific tentative optimism of a mountain spring that had earned itself through a long winter. I was in Grandma June's tool shed, clearing it methodically with the same approach I brought to any space that needed to be understood before it could be used, when I found the iron chest. It was under a pile of moth-eaten wool blankets in the corner, the kind of storage position that communicates, this is not hidden. It is simply waiting for someone who will know what to do with it. The lid required effort. The hinges protested with the specific complaint of metal that has not been asked to move in a very long time. Inside was a black ledger. Not a financial ledger, not in the sense of accounts receivable or portfolio valuations. This was a different kind of accounting entirely. I sat on a stack of old tires and turned the pages. For 40 years, my grandmother had been running what I could only describe as a covert humanitarian operation. The entries were not indexed by investment vehicle or asset class. They were indexed by need. Crestfall Elementary. Overdue lunch accounts. September 2003, $2,400. County High School. Textbook shortage. January 2007, $8,000. Winter coat drive. Anonymous donor. November 2011, $3,200. Brennan family. Medical bills. March 2015, $12,000. College application fees. 12 students. April 2019, $1,800. I ran my thumb down the final column of totals. $284,600. Over 40 years. Quietly. Without attribution. Without the expectation of gratitude or recognition, or the specific social currency that attaches to public generosity. She had been keeping the children of this town from going hungry, while her own children called her a drain. She had been paying for college applications while Frank complained about the cost of the Christmas ham. She had been running a 40-year operation of anonymous grace in a house with a leaking roof, and not one member of her immediate family had known, or, more precisely, had bothered to look. I sat in the tool shed for a long time. The magnitude of her pressed against my chest in a way that was not grief exactly. Grief I knew. Grief had a specific weight and texture I had been carrying since February 3rd, but something adjacent to it. The specific, overwhelming recognition of a person who has just understood, fully and finally, the scale of what they were in the presence of. My family had spent decades trying to drain her dry. They had never once realized she was pouring herself out for people who deserved it. Eleanor was waiting on the porch when I came out of the shed. She was the oldest continuous resident of Crestfall, 81 years old, with skin like good paper and eyes that had been watching this town and the people in it for longer than most of the town's current residents had been alive. She had known Grandma June since before my father was born. She had sat with her on Saturday afternoons when I couldn't be there. She had been at the funeral in the second row, the only person in that cemetery who hadn't been calculating. I held out the heavy iron keys to the house. "It's yours, Eleanor," I said. "Turn it into whatever it needs to be. A library, a shelter, a place where people can come when they need somewhere to be. I don't have a preference." I paused. "I just ask that no one named Gray ever comes to dinner here again." Eleanor took the keys without ceremony, the gesture of someone who understood the weight of what was being transferred and did not feel the need to perform either gratitude or solemnity. "Where are you going?" she said. "North," I said. She nodded. That was the entire conversation. I drove for 12 hours. The F-150 and I had covered enough miles together that the silence between us was comfortable, the easy quiet of two things that have learned each other's rhythms and no longer need to explain themselves. The hum of the tires against the highway was the only sound I needed. I crossed the Maine border as a gray, salt-heavy fog was rolling in off the Atlantic, turning the coastal landscape into something soft-edged and provisional, the way places look when they are still deciding what they want to be. I found a cedar cabin on a cliff outside a small town whose name required 3 attempts to pronounce correctly. It took the full force of the ocean. It smelled of wood smoke and salt, and the specific structural solitude of a place that has been standing in difficult weather for a long time and has made its peace with that. I registered at the local elementary school as a logistics instructor. The salary was $51,200. The students were 9 and 10 years old and had strong opinions about everything, and the work required me to be present and clear and useful in ways that had nothing to do with money or inheritance or the long, exhausting archaeology of a family's failures. It was enough. It was, in fact, considerably more than enough. The cat appeared on the 3rd week. He materialized on the porch one morning as though he had always been there and had simply been delayed. A ragged, battle-scarred tabby with one ear partially missing and the suspicious, assessing gaze of someone who has learned through experience not to extend trust without evidence. I named him Cather. He inspected the cabin with the methodical thoroughness of a professional and eventually determined that the porch chair, specifically the porch chair when it contained Grandma June's corn yellow sweater, which I had folded there one afternoon while I was working inside, was the location that best met his requirements. I found him there one evening when I came in from the woodpile, curled in the center of the yellow wool, his purr a low, vibrating engine that seemed to settle into the grain of the chair itself. I sat on the steps. My hands were calloused from the wood. The salt air was cold and direct and smelled of nothing complicated. Below the cliff, the Atlantic was doing what it always did, hitting the rocks with the relentless, disciplined persistence of a force that has decided what it is doing and intends to keep doing it regardless of the reception. I watched Cather in the yellow sweater. I thought about my grandmother pressing $10 bills into my palm for gas on Sunday evenings. I thought about the shoebox under the seat of the F-150, full of folded 10s and 20s that I had never spent because spending them had never felt like the point. I thought about the blue journal and the 487 entries and the red-stamped psychiatric evaluations and the brass key and the vault and the moment the deadbolt had slid home on a door that had been unlocked for 47 years. I thought about what she had said in the will. She is the only one who never once asked me what I had. I had not understood, when I first heard those words read aloud in Marcus Reed's conference room, that they were not just a description of me, they were an instruction, a final, specific, completely characteristic piece of advice from a woman who had spent her entire life understanding something that most people spend their entire lives missing. The worth of a thing is not what it contains. It is what you are willing to do without knowing what it contains. I had driven 400 miles every weekend for 10 years, not because I expected anything at the end of it. I had sat in that kitchen chair for 45 nights, not because I was calculating a return. I had smoothed that check with my thumb and tucked it into my chest pocket because a woman I loved had given it to me, and saying thank you was the honest response, not because of the number, but because of the giving. The $40 million was real. The scholarship foundation was real. The cedar cabin and the salt air and the elementary school students with their strong opinions were real. But none of it was the inheritance. The inheritance was the $10 bills in the shoebox. The inheritance was knowing how to show up on a Saturday. The inheritance was understanding, in the specific, embodied way that only comes from practice, that the most valuable thing you can give another person is your unhurried, ungrudging presence. My family had wanted the prize. They had never understood that the prize was the patrol. Wow. On a morning in late April, I walked to the edge of the cliff. The Atlantic was gray-green and cold and moving with the specific, enormous indifference of something that has been here far longer than any of us and will be here long after. The spray hit my face, sharp and clean and tasting of nothing but itself. I reached into my pocket. The brass key was there, worn smooth now from months of handling, the metal warm to body temperature, small and solid and utterly specific in its purpose. I held it over the water. I thought about what it had opened. Not just the safety deposit box, not just the vault with its cold air and its stack of documents. The key had opened the space between what my grandmother had kept hidden and what she had wanted me to understand. Between the woman the world saw in a corn yellow sweater, pressing $10 bills into her granddaughter's palm, and the woman who had been quietly, patiently, methodically building a fortress of truth for the day it would be needed. She had given me the key because she trusted me to use it correctly. I had used it correctly. The mission was complete. I opened my hand. The key caught the morning light for one brief second, a small flash of brass against the gray-green of the water below. And then it was gone. Taken by the ocean without ceremony, without drama, without the slightest acknowledgement of what it had been or what it had done. I stood at the edge of the cliff for a moment longer. Then I turned back toward the cabin. Cather was on the porch in the corn yellow sweater, his one good ear turned toward the sound of my footsteps on the path. The wood smoke smell was coming from the chimney. The morning was cold and clear and asking nothing of me except to be present in it. I had a class at 8. I had firewood to stack. I had a stray cat who had decided my porch was worth staying on. I had the silence. the specific, earned, uncluttered silence of a life that had been stripped of everything that was taking up room without deserving it. I had enough. I stepped inside and closed the door. For the first time in my life, I did not check the lock. The door that mattered had been open all along.
Hey!
If this story found you at the right moment, if it reminded you that showing up quietly and without expectation is the most powerful thing a person can do, share it with someone who needs to hear it. We tell one story a week. Subscribe and ring the bell. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done with the key?